Okay, hello and welcome to the Scoreboard Podcast. I'm your host, Rivka Boord of Jets X Factor, the home of the best New York Jets content on the internet. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe to jetsxfactor.com, discount code 80, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we're joined by a very special guest, Mark Bullock of Bullock's Film. What is it? Bullock's Film Reviews? Film Room on Substack. Substack. Okay, so Mark really covers the X's and O's of Commanders film breakdown, and we're very glad to have him. Mark, thanks for joining.
Of course. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so the first thing, the Jets and the Commanders have their joint practice on Thursday, and the first thing every Jet fan, or every fan around the league really would want to know is what's with Jayden Daniels? What did you think of him pre-draft? What do you think of him? Let's say, what are your expectations for him? What do you think his strengths and weaknesses are? Tell us a little bit about Jayden Daniels.
Yeah, I think just about everyone in the league kind of had Caleb Williams as the number one guy. I think Washington pretty quickly established that he was going to Chicago, and that wasn't going to be a possibility for them. So they started evaluating the other guys, and it certainly seems like Jayden Daniels was the guy they circled pretty early in the process, and they had a very thorough process, and there was a lot of noise made about the having all the quarterbacks in at the same time and not having individual time with guys and taking them to Top Golf and stuff like that. But I think what's come clear after the draft process is that Jayden Daniels was the guy that they have liked for a while. And he's come in and they've done, rather than the kind of usual rookie quarterback affair where they put him up to the podium every day and they announce him as the starter straight away, and then they put all this pressure and expectations on him. They've done a really nice job of kind of shielding him from that. He's only done a few press conferences, and he's they haven't put him in the spotlight. They've been very delicate with how they've handled him, and they've been putting the kind of other veterans that they've had. Jonathan Allen's gone up a couple of times, and Bobby Wagner's taken some turns and stuff like that. So they've shielded him quite a lot, and that's helped him kind of go a little bit under the radar in camp, as much as a second overall pick can do. But it certainly seems like he's doing really well. He seems to be progressing. Dan Quinn is not afraid to throw praise his way, and said he's exceeding expectations. And he said he's kind of had that kind of sentiment multiple times throughout training camp and the offseason. So he seems to be at a good level so far, and above where they thought he would be. But the real test will be, this joint practice and the preseason games. We'll actually get to see him against a different defense. Because what we've seen so far is he's been practicing against the same Washington defense for a few months now with OTAs and stuff. So that'll be really interesting to see is how he gets on against the different defense that he hasn't kind of understood. Okay, I know when that safety's coming down, I know this looks coming, and when that guy's rotating back, I know this looks coming, and I can kind of cheat a little bit. He's starting to get some of the answers to the test from playing the same defense for a while. So it'll be a good test to see how he stacks up against a different team.
So how much concern is there just thinking about, Jayden Daniels has some similarities with RG3, right? Just in terms of where they were drafted, their profiles, even the height and weight, like being kind of skinny. What do people like, let's say in Washington, how much fear is there that he's going to turn into another RG3 where he has a great rookie season and then just kind of disappears?
Yeah, I think that was certainly a big concern. My biggest concern with him was the hits that he takes. Mobile quarterbacks, I think there's a bit of a myth that mobile quarterbacks are more injury prone. They can be, but they can also avoid a lot of hits because of their mobility. The thing for Jayden Daniels is that he'd do an amazing play where he'd scramble and he'd run for 40 yards up the field, and then rather than accepting, okay, I've just made a 40-yard play, I'll just step out of bounds and then move on to the next one, it's, I can make this cut inside this defender and maybe pick up an extra 5 yards. And you love that competitiveness with him, but it would result in him taking some comical hits, really. And as you say, he's kind of a little bit he's 6'4", so he's a big guy, but he's I think he's around 200 pounds. They haven't listed exactly what he is
listed
right now,
at 210. I just Googled it.
Yeah, right. So he's a little bit undersized. So he's a little bit skinny, especially for a guy that's 6'4". So he's a you'd feel a little bit concerned about that, and that was my biggest concern with him. I thought he took too many hits in college that he didn't necessarily need to, and now you could, in theory, that's an easy fix. You say, hey, just step out of bounds, protect yourself, be a little bit more cautious. But my fear with him has always been, you get to 3rd and 2 in the fourth quarter with 2 minutes left, and is he going to protect himself and step out of bounds and accept that, okay, we might lose this game, but I'm protecting myself long term? Or is that competitive streak going to come out and be like, okay, I'm going to go win this game for my team and risk my health? And I think that's the tougher thing to turn off. That's what RG3 had an issue with, was he never slid and protect himself. He would always go for those extra yards and take some big hits. So yeah, you hope that Daniels can kind of learn those lessons, and this coaching staff can emphasize that. But that, I mean, if that's your biggest concern, I don't want to say if that's your biggest concern, then you're not really having many concerns. But because obviously the best ability is availability, and if he's not available, then that can ruin a career. But the rest of his game is a lot better than what I think people think it is. I think he has this kind of stigma around him that he's this, one read and run quarterback, which isn't true. He's very good at working through his progressions, and that's something that the coaching staff has emphasized, that he's done a really nice job of in OTAs and mini camps and training camp. Now it is working through progressions and the mental process of being a quarterback, getting to the line of scrimmage and making checks and seeing like, okay, I've got this guy coming off this edge, I need to adjust the protection, or I can just throw hot here, so I don't need to adjust the protection. And he's doing a lot of those advanced level quarterbacking stuff at the line of scrimmage, which you wouldn't necessarily expect from a rookie. So, and certainly not one where he has this stigma of being a one read and run quarterback. So I think there are a lot of good positive upsides for him. But yeah, that injury concern is certainly still a nagging concern. And I think it will always be until we see him on the field and taking those precautions to, slide or step out of bounds instead of trying to get those extra few yards. But, we'll just have to live with that, I expect. And hopefully he keeps himself healthy.
Okay, so now covering just the Commanders as a whole, Jets fans don't know much about the Commanders because they're in the opposite conference. Yes, they played the Jets last year, but in general, there's not a ton of knowledge. So how does their offseason shake up? What did they add and subtract? How's their roster looking now?
Yeah, it's probably been the biggest turnover of a team that potentially the NFL has seen, with, if you factor in, the ownership change, which happened last summer, but the new owners, they kind of left things as they were because they took over around about this time last year. So it was kind of too late to change anything. So they left like Ron Rivera and that whole regime in charge for the season. But now they've completely cleaned house. They've got a new GM in Adam Peters, who's come over from the 49ers, new head coach in Dan Quinn, new offensive coordinator, Cliff Kingsbury, and completely new staff. They're upgrading facilities and stuff like that. And they've turned over about half the roster already. So it's a very, very different team to what it was last year, from top to bottom. So it really is a completely new organization almost. And so yeah, the big names will be, that they still have Terry McLaurin at wide receiver. He'll be the big name on the offense. They've still got Jonathan Allen, Daron Payne at defensive tackle. So there'll be big names on defense. But they brought in Bobby Wagner, I mentioned earlier. Frankie Luvu from the Panthers is another one that they're excited about, because he's a linebacker, but they think they're going to use him more as a blitzer and a rusher than just a pure linebacker. So they're quite excited.
Former
about
Jet,
him.
by the way.
Yeah, Frankie exactly. Luvu. Exactly. And it's good to see how he works his way up. The NFL kind of, he was undrafted, right, and signed with the Jets, and then and then went to the Panthers, and then now signed a big free agent contract with Washington. So it's good to see that story play out, and he plays the right way. He has a real good mentality, and he's going to be a fun guy to watch. And then, yeah, on offense, obviously, Jayden Daniels, the guy we talked about, that's the one everyone's really excited to see. I think the run game is going to be better than what people think it will be, because Cliff Kingsbury is known as being this pass-first air raid guy. When you go back and look at his Cardinals teams, they actually ran the ball a lot more than what people remember, and they had a couple of 1,000-yard rushers in his time there. So running back Brian Robinson's another name that I think will be an interesting watch. I think he could have a good year. Yeah, they have lots of fresh faces, and it's going to be interesting to see how they put it all together, because, as I say, it's a completely new organization from almost top to bottom.
Okay, so you mentioned Terry McLaurin, so talk a little bit about their receivers. So why has Terry McLaurin, I mean, the answer is obvious here, but like, let's say, how good do you think Terry McLaurin is compared to, like, let's say, the other great NFL receivers? Because he got a big contract, like, what was it, a year or two ago? And then he kind of fell off the radar because Washington's offense was so bad. So where do you think he actually stacks up from what you've watched of him compared to, like, some of the top receivers in the NFL?
Yeah, I don't think he's a top 5 receiver. He's not in the elite tier of, whether you have a Tyreek Hill and a Justin Jefferson and a CD Lamb. He's not with those guys, but he's probably in that sort of second tier of the next sort of 10 to 15 group of receivers. And so I think the thing with him is he's so consistent. He's managed to put 1,000-yard seasons together every year, regardless of the amount of quarterback change they've had in Washington. I think he's played with some absurd amount of like 20 quarterbacks or something like that in his 4 or 5 years in the NFL. So he's caught passes from a lot of guys, and he's still been consistent, still been able to be very productive. Hopefully now Jayden Daniels will be the guy that can solidify that position, and they can build a rapport, and then you can see McLaurin really showcase his talents, and maybe push himself up towards that upper tier of receivers. And I don't necessarily think he'll ever get to that top 5 group. He'll obviously say he thinks he can get there. I don't think he's in that elite category, but I certainly think he can be in that tier below it. And I think he's already in that tier below it, but he's maybe at the bottom of that tier, and he can work his way up towards the top of that tier. He's got excellent speed. He's got very good route running ability, and he's incredibly hard worker, a great leader. Everyone in the locker room loves him. So he has pretty much the total package that you're looking for. He lacks maybe the elite polish of some of the other guys. His routes can be a little bit cleaner, and he can do the finer details a little bit more. And he always emphasizes every offseason he goes away and he works on certain individual things. And he's really good at explaining, like a few years ago, it was after his rookie year, he really struggled releasing against press coverage against the most physical corners. And he went away in the offseason and traded with former Seahawk receiver Doug Baldwin, who was really good at releasing against press coverage. So he spent that offseason working on that. And then you saw in his second season, he was much better at that. And he has consistently improved in that regard. And this year he talked about improving his route running and the finer details at the top of his route. And so I would fully anticipate him improving those, because he puts in the work and he knows the weaknesses in his game that he needs to improve. So I think he will take another step forward, and hopefully the quarterback situation where it's a little bit more stable with a rookie quarterback will help him, as opposed to having to play with a bunch of guys that, probably aren't on NFL rosters around the league right now. So yeah, hopefully he can take that step forward, but he's definitely a very, very good receiver.
So some of your description sounds a little like Garrett Wilson with the Jets, where he's played with a bunch of quarterbacks, been productive, but probably had a ceiling capped, may not ever. I mean, I think he might have a chance of joining the elite receivers, but maybe not. Like, he's probably maybe shown it's hard to say exactly without having watched McLaurin's film how they stack up, but it's kind of sounds a little similar. Like, again, you haven't seen the ceiling of what they can be because the quarterback situation has just been ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, Garrett Wilson is probably a fairly decent comparison. I think they're slightly different receivers, but in terms of the career paths that they've had, where, as you say, that they've had a bunch of different quarterbacks, I'd say at this point in his career, I would still go with McLaurin just because he's had that extra bit of experience. but you certainly there's a lot of upside in Wilson's game, and hopefully a year with a fully healthy Aaron Rodgers will unlock that potential. And maybe in a year's time, you're probably leaning more one way than the other. But yeah, that's certainly a decent comparison.
So now getting to just the Commanders, one of the things you look at their roster and it's just like, is that offensive line, like, that's been a big issue for Washington, as far as I understand, for a while. And you look at it and it's like, I mean, I'm just looking at the ESPN depth chart. I don't know if this is accurate, but they have Brandon Coleman at left tackle, Nick Allegretti at left guard, Tyler Biadasz at center, Sam Cosmi at right guard, and Trent Scott at right tackle. Now, Allegretti was a backup with Kansas City. And some of those, Biadasz was like a good run blocker with Cowboys. I think struggled as a pass blocker. I think Cosmi is a little bit underrated from what I understand. But then some, I mean, a lot of kind of no names there. Can you talk a little bit about the Commanders' offensive line? What are the expectations, and is that a concern heading into the season?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest concern with the probably the whole team, but certainly the offense going into the year is how that offensive line shapes up. I think you mentioned Sam Cosmi is certainly the standout piece. He struggled a little bit early in his career when they tried to play him at right tackle. He's moved inside to right guard now, and he had a really strong year last year, and he's going into a contract year this year, so he has plenty of incentive to play pretty well, and I think he'll probably earn a pretty sizable contract. Biadasz, I think, is a solid addition at center. Still young enough to improve, but has 4 years of experience in the NFL and a decent team with like the Cowboys that have had some pretty good coaching, and so he should bring a bit of stability at center. Allegretti is a bit of an unknown cause. As you say, he was a backup with the Chiefs. That Chiefs offensive line, they spent a lot on that interior, and they've got some really good players. So it's pretty hard to crack that top three of the interior offensive line. So it's not to say Allegretti was a bad player because he was a backup there. He could well be a starting player elsewhere, but you just don't know that because he hasn't really had the opportunity. And the amount of times he's been on the field has been quite limited. It seems like he's going to settle in at left guard, though. They certainly signed him with the intent for him to start at left guard. At left tackle is probably the biggest question. They wanted to trade back up in the first round to get another left tackle, but they just didn't fancy the price of what it was going to cost to get from the top of the second round. I think it was pick 36 to try to get back up to sort of 18, 19 range to land one of those left tackles. It was going to cost them a fortune, probably an extra first round pick next year and stuff like that, which they weren't willing to give up at this point in the rebuild. So what they ended up doing was drafting Brandon Coleman in the third round. As you mentioned, he's had a decent camp so far. It seems like he's the guy that's going to be given the first opportunity to be the left tackle, but a third round rookie is always a question mark, especially at that left tackle spot, and especially with a rookie at quarterback as well. So I think these joint practices with the Jets and then Washington travel to Miami in a few weeks to have some joint practices down there. I think those will be really telling to see whether Coleman can win that spot and kind of say, yeah, I can be a starting left tackle in this league, or whether he's kind of exposed a little bit as these why he was a third round pick rather than a first round pick. And so that'll be one of the interesting storylines that Washington will keep an eye on. So I think the interior will be better than it has been, providing everyone stays healthy. The question marks are on the edges. And if Coleman comes off, then that's a huge boost. I think he'll certainly have his ups and downs. All rookies do, obviously, but that's one thing that they will be really, really desperate to see with this joint practice is how he does against those Jets edge rushers.
Yeah, I mean that definitely is a challenge. Even, I mean, Hassan Reddick would probably line up. I mean, I think they would switch around, but he's still facing Jermaine Johnson. You got plenty there, so it'll be a challenge. Now, speaking of the joint practices, I know you say obviously you're not local, so you're not seeing the joint practices or anything like that. But if you were there, what would you keep your closest eye on? I know you mentioned Coleman, obviously mentioned Daniels, but like maybe some of the other things that you would keep an eye on, or even with Daniels and Coleman, like what are the specific things you would look for? I know it's hard to see anyway when you're not there, but like let's say this was game conditions and you were watching, you had all 22 film. What would be the things that you were looking for from the team in general, from Daniels, from Coleman?
Yeah, so we'll start with Coleman as that's where we were. The things with him was in college he had really nice feet. His footwork was good. His issue was more with his hands. He tended to punch with both hands at the same time. He didn't use independent hands, which if you punch with both hands, you kind of tend to bring yourself forward and pull yourself off balance. And you can get away with that when he's got a really good strike. So when he contacts with both those hands, he can disrupt rushers quite well. But the more elite rushers will kind of see him coming and just kind of knock him off balance and get by him pretty quickly. So whether he has improved in this offseason with that better individual hand usage, and there was some training camp practices and off-season practices where you saw him working specifically on those individual hand usage in certain drills. So that'd be the main thing I'd be looking for from him is how well does he handle those better rushers that the Jets have on the edge. Washington has some decent guys, but not the caliber of edge rushers that the Jets do. So that'll be interesting to see how he does in sort of one-on-ones and stuff like that against those guys. With Daniels, you're looking just to see, how well does he handle a different defense that's being presented to him, kind of like we mentioned earlier, where he's been practicing all offseason against the same scheme. And by all accounts, he's done a really nice job of understanding like the different looks they're presenting to him and the different blitzes and the different coverages. But how does that translate when it's a new team that you haven't been facing for 3 months? So that will be interesting. That'll definitely be something I'm watching for. And on the defensive side of the ball, the secondary is going to be really interesting for Washington. That they have a bunch of really interesting pieces, but they're all pieces that there is a world where like 5 or 6 of them aren't on the team in a 2 years time. But there is also just as equally a chance where 3 or 4 of them really stand out and become long-term pieces. So it's all a bunch of potential, and particularly with Dan Quinn and Joe Witt Jr., the defensive coordinator, those guys in Dallas did a really nice job of mixing in different personnel packages. The thing we had in Washington with Ron Rivera was they were a very basic defense. They played their 4 defensive linemen, they played the 2 linebackers, and then they played their 5 defensive backs. And they would maybe change sometimes the nickel corner for safety and play 3 safety packages. But it was basically those 2 different packages. Dan Quinn and Joe Witt Jr. play like 10 or 11 different packages where, depending on the personnel or the situation, they might bring in an extra safety to play man coverage on a tight end. They might bring in an extra corner. They might bring down a safety as a dime linebacker, and they might move around the defensive lineman. They might play extra linebackers, like we talked about with Frankie Louvu being a guy that they potentially see more as a rusher than a traditional linebacker. They might move him all over the place. So there's some exciting packages that I think we'll see, and we'll hopefully get a glimpse of that with these joint practices. So that's what will be interesting. But they don't quite have the depth that certainly that they had in Dallas for the last few years. So it'll be interesting to see who can kind of, if anyone kind of rises to the top and stakes their claim for, I'm going to be your starting cornerback, I'm going to be your starting safety, I'm going to be your starting linebacker, or whether it's kind of a case of everyone kind of struggles and we have to pick the best guy from a bad group. So that's what will be interesting to see, and I think the Jets will provide a pretty good test for that. So
Quinn plays as a base 3-4, right?
Yeah, he played. I think they're playing more of a 4-3.
Okay.
But I don't think they've even really practiced in a 4-3. I think they pretty much played nickel the entire time. So they played 4 down, 2 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. Usually a nickel corner, sometimes a safety as the 5th corner, as the 5th guy. But they've pretty much been in nickel the entire time, from my understanding.
I mean, and that's how the Jets play, but the Jets also play that very basic defensive front. They played nickel over 80% of the time last year, which was the second highest rate in the league. And they present a very basic look, but they just have really good players. So what ends up happening is it's just hard to beat them that way.
If you have the good players, you can play that basic look. It works. The issue for Washington under Rivera is that they didn't have the players to run those basic looks. So I think that was going to be the interesting and then the fun part of what Quinn and Witt are going to do with this defense is they have some holes that they need to kind of cover up, and they don't really have anyone at corner right now that you say, yes, this is our starting number one corner that we're going to put on a number one receiver. And maybe someone can emerge from this practice as, oh, they had a really good practice, and then in the preseason game they have a really good preseason game, and maybe they start to emerge as that top guy. But right now they don't have anyone that you would sort of bet on being their number one corner going to the year.
So that kind of leads me to my next question is, which Commanders players have the most to prove, particularly in the joint practice or in preseason if they're going to play? Which players have the most, like you feel like have the most at stake or have the most to show, in those things? Like, because that would give a Jet fan an eye of what to look for on the other side.
Yeah, well, we talked about Brandon Coleman a lot. Obviously, that left tackle position is a very important one. Obviously, Jayden Daniels will have stuff to prove. I think the corner position that we were just mentioning, they have last year's first round pick was Emmanuel Forbes, and he really struggled, but he wasn't put in the best positions to succeed. I think this coaching staff will do a much better job of tailoring the scheme to fit what he does and his skill set and what he does well. And this coaching staff likes to emphasize getting the hands on the ball and creating turnovers, and that's what Forbes was known for in college. I think he had the record for the most number of pick sixes in his. I can't remember which division he was in college, but whatever conference he was in, he had the record for most pick sixes in a year. So that was something he did really well in college, and we didn't really get to see it last year because they didn't put him in the positions to do that. So he's someone that has a lot to potentially prove and gain. But the other corners that they have on the roster don't exactly scream like we're set in stone as being the guys. They have a corner called Benjamin St. Juste, who was a third-round pick 3 years ago now. And he has, if you look at him athletically, he has the profile exactly of a top-tier corner. He's got great size, great length, terrifically quick feet. He hasn't put it all together, and he was drafted as kind of a project that needed to put it all together, and the previous coaching staff didn't really do a good job of putting it all together. And you hope that this staff can, but you do kind of wonder after 3 or 4 years, is he going to be able to put it all together? So that's another one that has stuff to prove. And then the third corner is Michael Davis, who signed from the Chargers, and he's had some good years in the NFL. He's been a really good press coverage corner, but he has tended to go up and down every year. So he'll have a year where he's like in the sort of top 10, even top 5 rated press corners. And then the next year he'll be one of the worst. And last year he was one of the worst. So Washington certainly will be hoping he bounces back to being one of the best, as is kind of his career trend has been. But you just don't know. And so they have a lot of question marks at corner. So if one or two of those guys can kind of step up and have some good performances against like Garrett Wilson, as we were talking about, or maybe trick Aaron Rodgers. I'm not sure. I'm assuming he's going to practice. I think he's in practice. Yeah. So if you can maybe trick Aaron Rodgers into something and get some interceptions, then that's going to kind of stand out and be like, hey, maybe I can claim this spot as the starting corner. So I think that'll be the areas that I'd be looking at for these joint practices.
So I guess one last question. The Commanders over-under is 6.5 wins. What are you picking, and I guess describe why?
I think this coaching staff is going to do a lot better of getting the most out of the talent the roster has right now. And so that leads me to think that they might just edge the over. It would be 7. I don't think they're going to go and win 10 games unless Jayden Daniels turns out to be, CJ Stroud from last year. Then maybe they can push sort of 8 or 9, maybe 10 wins. But assuming Jayden Daniels is a normal rookie quarterback, and the rest of the roster plays to the best of their abilities, I'd say probably about 7 wins is right. But I feel like the roster overall lacks talent and depth, and if you get a few injuries to key spots, and if Brandon Coleman, as we talked about, isn't quite ready at left tackle, and they don't really have a viable other option, then that's going to significantly hinder the rest of the offense. And like we talked about with corner, if no one steps up and makes their claim for a spot, then suddenly you're putting together a secondary where you don't really have any confidence in anyone, and you're having to work around that. And so that again significantly hinders what you can do on defense with the scheme. I think the talent will probably limit them to 7 wins, and if they have a significant injury at a big position, then that could easily take them below that mark. But I think this coaching staff, I believe the staff that they have in place is going to do a much better job of getting the most out of the talent they have. I think it's just because it's in year 1 of a rebuild and they've had so much turnover that the talent they have at the top of the roster is okay, but the depth behind it is just minimal. So, I think it could easily fall below that if they get 1 or 2 injuries.
Okay, so Mark, now I know we're talking to Jets fans here, but you could still just tell everyone where they can find you, what you're up to, things like that.
Sure. So you mentioned earlier my Substack is Bullock's Film Room, which it's just markbullock.substack.com. If you want breakdowns of Commanders football, or I do stuff, a lot of stuff breaking down the X's and O's of NFL stuff, so it translates to other teams. So some fans might be interested in that. Or if you want Twitter, or I guess X now, then it's just at Mark Bullock NFL, and I do some breakdowns and stuff on there as well. So, that's where you can find me.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much for joining. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe to jetsxfactor.com, discount code 80, and check us out wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much.